Okay, so we're going to go over Frederick Douglass, and we're basically going to deal with the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, which is the novel that we had just read in PDF form. One of the things that you need to start out with is what state was he born in at this time, and that current state. You need to think about this. He was born in Virginia, and stayed there for a short time until he was sold up north a little bit to Baltimore, Maryland. Mrs. Auld, who was one of the masters, the female masters, basically, she started out kind, but the problem was is that she became cruel due to slavery. Slavery basically made her lazy, gave her the opportunity to be mean without worrying about anybody saying anything back to her. And so essentially slavery was what made her become a cruel person. Now, the thing about Douglass was there were certain facts about his coming into this world that he knew about, but it wasn't said for certain. It was all kind of rumor. And that it was rumored that his father was actually his master, and he was white. But they could never actually confirm that. Now, the custom normally back in those days was that infants who were born as slaves were usually cared for by the elderly, mostly the elderly grandmother types who could no longer work in the fields. Now, in his upbringing, his first real experience with slavery was the lashing that his aunt took. He called it, in quote, the blood-stained gate. And it was like it marked an entry into to hell, because he was in the kitchen pantry at the time trying to steal some food for himself when his aunt was brought in by the master, who was jealous that she had been touched by another man, hung her up and began to whip her to the point where like chunks of her were falling all over the floor. She was bleeding everywhere and she screamed, and he was forced to watch that so he wouldn't get caught while he was in hiding. Looking at some of the things that he dealt with, Frederick Douglass's mother's name was, if you look at it, Harriet Bailey. And what we look at with his mother is that she didn't live very long, and he didn't really have much of a relationship with her. She died when he was very young, so he doesn't really have much of a recollection. If we flash forward a little bit to when he is a little bit grown up, he's not broken yet, because he went straight from the plantation to the Auld farm, where he took care of Master Auld, Thomas Auld, a kid who was his same age. But essentially, once he got to a certain age, he was given back to a man named Covey, whose job was he was known as a slave breaker. He had a nickname by the slaves called the Snake, because he liked to hide in the brush and pop out and catch them not doing their work, so he could beat them and train them to be broken. Basically, at some point, Covey tries to bind Douglass's legs with a rope, and this was the moment that Douglass fought back, and he ended up grabbing Covey by the throat and fighting back, and would not be made to be subservient at this juncture. This battle between Covey and Douglass is an extended metaphor, and it's used to represent change in Frederick when he fights back. It's the first time he truly respected the fact that he could be killed by fighting back, he could be dead, but it was a new beginning for him. You have to think of it as a rebirth and it's like a resurrection. He was born into slavery as a slave, but the moment he fought back from Covey, he was resurrected as a new man and became his own man, a free man, and he was rebirthed. Inside, he was free. Outside, he may have still been chained by the chains of slavery, whether they are invisible or real, but it was a resurrection, a new beginning for him by fighting back. 3 of the happiest days for Douglass were spent when he found out he was going to go live with the Auld family, because they gave him food, they gave him time to clean and scrub off all the dead skin, they gave him new clothes and shoes, so it was one of the happiest days that he got to experience. So you see, the wretchedness of a slave is measured most by their hunger, and of course their whether they're cold, their lack of clothing, shelter, things like that. And so the biggest thing though really is hunger. If a slave is hungry, that means its master's not feeding them. You can be naked all you want, but that is the most wretchedness of a slave. When Douglas finally was a free man, when he finally escaped to freedom, he was 21 years old. So he lived 21 years before he was able to escape. When slave owners figured out or discovered that Douglas was attempting to teach other slaves how to read, he was teaching them their ABCs in the Bible and stuff like that. They reacted by rushing upon them with sticks and stones and hitting them with them and beating on them to break up it, to show that is never to happen again. The first time Douglas was even advised to run away, he'd never even expected or wanted to, and seek the aid of abolitionists, people who don't believe in slavery, who want to help slaves their freedom, were these two Irishmen. They were unloading a boat, and they were unloading this stone, and Douglas had helped them, and they basically told him he should run away north. That was the first time he was ever told. Other factors that go into it, the overseer, Mr. Gore, he was an overly vicious man. And one of the things that he did, one of the crimes that he did, was there was a slave named Demby, and he told him to come out of the water when Demby had run away from a beating, and he gave him to the count of 3. And if he didn't, he'd kill him. And after that, he basically he fired. He fired his gun and killed Demby, and he did not lose his job. Douglas observed the difference in treatment of slaves from the city and from the South is that in the city they are treated much better. There's less slaves per family because it's a big city and there's not plantations. So they are to dress a certain way with their group and act a certain way, and they are fed and given shelter on the premises most of the time versus on the plantation. At the death of his master, and next his daughter Lucretia, Douglas was considered the greatest injustice after they had died was to his grandmother, who they gave her freedom to, and basically she was too old to take care of herself, and essentially she was confined to a home that she couldn't take care of herself, and she died suffering. When Covey, in their fight with Douglas, calls out to Bill to help him to subdue or to help stop Douglas, basically he refuses to intervene. He's hired to work, not to deal with slaves. The city into which Douglas first escaped was New York. He went up north to New York along that way. The songs that the slaves used to sing, people in the North believed actually that they were songs of joy because they've never heard slaves sing on a plantation, so it sounded really beautiful to them, but really they were not happy, but they really did think that they were joyful. One of the things about Douglas that is not true in the conclusion of this novel is he is still enslaved. And or not that he's still enslaved, but that he suffers physical abuse from white men regularly, and he doesn't. Once he escapes, he is able to keep from those beatings ever happening again and live a life, even though he's still technically enslaved, because slavery is a very real thing. And he vows that he will only be a slave in form only, but he does regain his sense of freedom and dignity. Now, Sandy advises that if Douglas carries the root, he can't be touched, he can't be hurt. But we all know that this is false. Although he does do it, Covey still beats him. Slaves often argued and fought amongst each other over whose owner was richer, because no matter how bad it was to be a slave, to be the poorest slave of a poor man was just worse. Douglas practiced learning his writing by, he practiced his ABCs, first of all, using with the kids, on the streets and stuff like that. But his actual practice of handwriting came from Thomas's used copybooks. When his mistress refused Douglas the opportunity to teach himself to read, he turned to the little boys in the street and would challenge them to spelling contests and stuff, so he would learn how to spell words. The most highly regarded of the slaves in Colonel Lloyd's plantation, they were employed in the main sloop or boat because they got to leave the plantation. Imagine being born onto a plantation and you never leave it. So that was probably the greatest job that there was to have. Colonel Lloyd owned this home plantation, which Douglas worked, and it was considered the main hub of all the surrounding farms. Douglas had two sisters and a brother, but he didn't even have a close relationship with them. He didn't even know them. So really, I mean, they never shared anything. And the general time frame that a slave can determine that the age of them is basically harvesting season, planting time, the seasons, because the slave isn't told the dates of when they're born. As a slave and a small child, Douglas suffered the most from hunger, because he was the smallest, so he always had to get the last scraps of whatever food was left. He learned that the pathway to freedom from slavery was education, which another word for that is literacy, learning how to read. He believed that religious slaveholders were the worst because they used God as a means of beating people even more. But while he was there with the Auld family, his duties basically was to take care of Thomas Auld, their son. He looked after him, and he was supposed to take care of him. During his time, though, as he got older, and he lent himself out to work and stuff, and worked on boats and learned how to caulk and things like that, he was beaten in a savage attack. But the reason nobody was charged in the beating of it was because no white man would testify on his behalf against his attacker. So therefore, because he had nobody to testify, he was supposed to go free, and no one was charged. Douglas would spend his times along those bank lines looking out towards those white sails of ships that were leaving on the Chesapeake Bay, because he knew that they were free from chains. They were going to another place that were away from the slavery issue, and wished greatly for that himself. The slave owner whose ownership where the master is his father is generally treated worse, not better, by their father. The first severe whipping Mr. Covey gave Douglas was because he didn't know how to drive an oxen in a cart. He just said, "Here, take this out," and he'd never done it before, and he wrecked the cart. Mrs. Auld did not teach Douglas how to read fluently. She was only able to teach him his ABCs, but it was enough to get him started. The trade that Douglas learned after he returned to Baltimore was, of course, how to be a caulker, in caulking things and sealing them, like windows and boat planks and things like that. Slave owners did not desire their slaves to ever read or write, because it didn't make them better workers. It would teach them how to rebel against their masters. At 7 or 8 years old, Douglas was sent to live in Baltimore with the Auld family. Douglas thinks the root may bring him luck because, well, when he first comes back with the root that he was given to by Sandy, he was not, Covey ignored him after he returned and didn't attack him, so he thought it might work. But the moment of epiphany for Douglas after Covey's fight, where he remained a slave, was 4 years. 4 years after that fight, he was going to be free. Douglas walked to Master Thomas's store to basically seek help from him because Covey had beaten him so bad when he was sick from fanning the wheat that he thought that he was going to kill him. But of course, Master Thomas had already taken money for his services, so he told him he had to go back the next day. Douglas punishes, though, his master later on for taking away his privilege of hiring himself out by simply refusing to work. See, he was making Master Auld money by sending his services out to work. So when he stopped working, that was extra money that Master Auld did not get in his pocket. So therefore, that is why he stopped. It was a common practice that children were parted from their mothers at a very early age, and it was to hinder affection for the parents and their child for their parents, so it would not incur a rebellion. During the course of this novel, though, Douglas shows how he is always moving from fear to defiance and then essentially freedom. All right, if you pay attention to this and you look over and listen to what I've told you, you should do pretty well on this assessment. After we take this assessment, we'll then go and we'll watch a movie called